And Chazal say it's manche to say no, but the date we as Yidden call it Pesach because of the Korban Pesach that we bring. The Korban Pesach, the Rebbe even explains good to Torah that the Korban Pesach was the key factor that created the ability for the Yidden to go out of Mitzrayim. Pasach Aleim, the idea that the Yidden Eibishter skipped over the homes and then allowed the Yidden to go out of Mitzrayim was because of the Korban Pesach. The uniqueness of the Korban Pesach also is seen in the fact that this is the only Korban that the Torah gives a second option. The Rebbe explains that the reason is because being that the Korban Pesach is Leidas Am Yisrael, that's like the Korban of birth. That's when the Yidden we became a people, and so we want every individual to be able to participate in this Korban and even if someone missed it, they should have a second opportunity. So the idea of the Korban Pesach isn't just the Korban that we have on the Yom Tov of Pesach, but rather it actually has a very central element to the Yom Tov. As we'll see soon, even the Gemara, even the idea of what we do throughout the 7-day Yom Tov celebration is be'emes shaykhs to the Korban Pesach itself, as we'll see soon in the lesson of the Mishnah. So what we do today is we're going to see that the Korban Pesach, I'm just going through the different interesting differences between the way the Korban Pesach is celebrated throughout the ages, and identify here 6 different tkufas, 6 different times. And while we're going through them, is that the Rebbe gives from these different elements of it. So we'll start with the first Korban Pesach. The first Korban Pesach was Pesach Mitzrayim. It's referred to as in Chazal as Pesach Mitzrayim. The Korban Pesach they took from Mitzrayim. There's sheets here if anyone wants to follow along. And there's a Mishnah in the Sefes Psachim and a Pesefta Braisa that elaborates on the differences between the Korban Pesach as it was brought in Mitzrayim and the Korban Pesach as it was done throughout the age, throughout in the Beis HaMikdash. What's referred to in Chazal as Pesach Doidos, the Korban Pesach for the future generations. So the Mishnah says as follows: Ma ben Pesach Mitzrayim and the Pesach Doidos. What's the difference between the Korban Pesach as it was brought in Mitzrayim and as it was brought throughout the generations in the Beis HaMikdash? So the Mishnah only identifies 3 or 4 differences. But the Braisa has some more. I only actually brought a few more from the Braisa to bring out the Rebbe's point of the Sikha, but the Braisa actually has other ones as well. Each one of these could have a shiur for itself in each of the Korban Pesach. We're trying to go through all of them, so we'll just go through the main points of them. So the first difference the Mishnah says is Pesach Mitzrayim Nikvei Miba'asar. The Korban Pesach, we all know that on Shabbos HaGadol, we celebrate the day that the Yidden on the 10th of NIssan, the Yidden took the Korban Pesach, the sheep, and they had to bring it to their homes and keep it for 4 days until the Korban Pesach was brought on the 14th. So for those 4 days, the sheep was in their home. What was the purpose of keeping the sheep in the home for 4 days? So there's a halacha that before you bring a korban, you have to make sure that the korban is a tamim, that the korban is complete, that the korban has no blemishes. And so the halacha is you need 4 days to look at the korban to make sure that the korban is complete. So in simple terms, this is what the Yidden were doing 4 days. In fact, the halacha for this, the concept is taken from this idea that 4 days before Korban Pesach, the Eibush already told the Yidden they should take the korban into the homes, the sheep that they can use as a korban into their homes on the 10th of Nisan. However, the Mishnah is saying here that that's only in Mitzrayim. So the Gemara explains that there's 2 halachas. One halacha is that you have to be mevakar the behema, you have to check the animal. But over here by Pesach, the halacha was different. It wasn't just that they had to bring it to the homes to check, but they had to be mafresh the korban. They had to set the korban aside 4 days in advance, which means that let's say on a regular year in Beis HaMikdash, you had a bunch of different sheep and you weren't sure which one was the one you wanted the Korban Pesach. I don't know how they chose their sheep, but they wanted to know which one was going to be the one that was going to be for the Korban Pesach. So you could take 3, 4 of them, and you could be mavakar each one over each day. You make sure each one's good, and at a Pesach you decide which one you're going to use as the korban. In other words, the setting aside the animal for the korban could take place on Erev Pesach. The looking at the animal to know which animal you want, to make sure the animal doesn't have any blemishes, that you need 4 days for. But you don't have to set this korban aside until the day that you actually bring the korban. Whereas in Mitzrayim, already 4 days before, they were obligated to set the animal aside, that this is the animal that they're going to use for the korban. So that's the first difference. So the Rebbe says, what's the Yiddah from this? Why is it that we need 4 days in advance to set it aside as a carbon, unlike all the other carbon, unlike the Ladoides for the generations following? They only had to search it and make sure it's not blemished. And so here the Rebbe explains based on the Rashi. If you want to learn the Sikha in detail, it's a Chedek Tezayim Parshas Boy. The Rebbe explains that the Yidden didn't have any mitzvahs before they went out of Mitzrayim. Not Mrs. Aseh, not Mrs. Leisasta. So in order for the Yidden to be able to have the proper, in order for the Yidden to have the proper clothing to be able to go out of Mitzrayim, like we say in the Agod, the area that they were naked of mitzvahs. So in order to successfully take them out, the way they did, the Eibushter gave them 2 mitzvahs. The bris milah, which is a positive mitzvah, the mitzvahs aseh of having a bris, and then the mitzvahs, and then they gave them the Korban Pesach. Those are the 2 bloods that they had on that night. So the Korban Pesach that they had was the idea of mitzvahs loisasa. What's the mitzvahs loisasa of Korban Pesach? It's also mitzvahs aseh. What's the mitzvahs loisasa of the Korban Pesach? So the Rebbe explains that we all know that the avodah zarah of Mitzrayim was the sheep. So by taking the sheep and using it as a carbon, what the Yid is doing is he's removing himself from the avodah zarah and bring as a carbon. In other words, the Korban Pesach wasn't just the mitzvah of Korban Pesach for the Yid in Mitzrayim. When the Yid in Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of Korban Pesach was a way of them separating themselves from avodah zarah. How do we make sure that the Yid's really separated from avodah zarah and that he's not just bringing the Korban Pesach because the Eibushter told him to bring the Korban Pesach? So for this, the Eibushter said, I want you to set aside the Korban Pesach 4 days in advance. And if for 4 days you still have the sheep with you and you're preparing for the Korban Pesach, you didn't give up. You didn't say, oh, forget the Korban Pesach, it's avodah zarah. You're involved in the carbon, not just as a preparation for the carbon because you're searching to make sure it doesn't have a blemish like every carbon needs. But moreover, you actually set it aside as a carbon already. And you're dealing with it as this is your carbon. Every day you look at it, this is the carbon that I set aside. So for 4 days, you already set yourself aside for the Korban Pesach. That gives you the complete disconnection from avodah zarah. Why 4 days? That brings an interesting example. We see by the Akedah. What happened by the Akedah? By the Akedah, it says that the Eibushter told Avraham to bring Yitzchak as the Akedah, but it says by Yom HaShlishi, on the 3rd day, is when the actual Akedah took place. And Rashi says, why did it take to the 3rd day? Because we shouldn't say that he was like, Hashem told him, so he did it without Yeshivas, without a clear mind. So wait 3 days, and you do it then, we know that you're doing it with clarity. So the 3rd day was the 4th day for when Hashem told him, because by Yashka Avram Abayka, the next day is when Avram went. So the Rebbe considers the day that Hashem told him day 1, even though I think it was at night. So, but whatever, the Rebbe continues, the first day is the day that, day 1 was maybe by Karbonis, but the first day is the day Hashem told him. And it was only on the 4th day from when Hashem told him, including the days, that he actually brought the Akedah, that they brought Yitzchak onto the Akedah. So from there we learn that if you want to see that someone did something properly, with proper Yeshivas, a proper thought process, and not just rushed into it, so then you have the mitzvah of, you have it for 4 days. So that's why the Yidden were obligated to do it for 4 days. By holding the Korban Pesach for 4 days, they were showing that they were completely separated from avodah zarah. So therefore, that's why it's understood why this halacha is only for Mitzrayim. They didn't have it for the later generations. The later generations, you have the din that you have to make sure that the carbon doesn't have a blemish, so you have to search it for 4 days. But the need to separate yourself from avodah zarah wasn't applicable to the later generations. So that's why only in Mitzrayim do they have the mitzvah to actually set aside the carbon 4 days in advance, so that way they know that their separation from avodah zarah was complete. The second difference is that they took the blood and they had a mitzvah to put the blood on the doorpost, the 2 doorposts, and on the what's the called with the lentil on top. So so we'll skip to the Tosefta now to see the uniqueness of this halacha. We take a look also what it says in the Braisa. The Tosefta says that in Pesach Mitzrayim they did not have to bring it onto the Mizbeach. In other words, they didn't bring a carbon onto the Mizbeach. It's actually other mefarshim that say that when they put it on the shpud, when they put it on the spit to roast, that was like the carbon. They did it for the sake of the Eibishter. But simple pshat in the Braisa is that they didn't have they didn't have a mizbeach. Pesach Mitzrayim, Nemru Vatanli say it's Ishu Pesach Beisad Boiker, Asheka Pesach Deidis. The carbon by Pesach Mitzrayim, they weren't allowed to leave their homes until the morning. Whereas every other year, you finish your Korban Pesach, you have to stay there and do Korban Pesach. But after you finish Korban Pesach, you go home and go to sleep. Pesach Mitzrayim, Kolach Sheikh Teich Beisay, Pesach Deis, Koiso Sheikh Makom Echad. In the Mitzrayim, all the Korban Pesach was done in their personal homes. And in their personal homes, and even that they had a neighbor, if they couldn't fit by themselves, they didn't have enough people in the house to finish a whole Korban Pesach, so then they were allowed to go to their immediate neighbor. But more than that, they weren't allowed. They had to stay put in their own homes. Whereas in the Pesach Deidis, they did it in the Hazara, they did it in the Beis HaMikdash. They ate wherever they ate. And finally, the Pesach Mitzrayim, the place where they ate, that's where they went to sleep. When the Pesach Deidis, they could eat in one place and sleep in another place. So what do we see from all these examples that the Braisa brings? That in Pesach Mitzrayim, there was a very unique connection to the home that they were in where the Korban Pesach had to be brought. Every person had to do it in their own home. They had to sleep there. They couldn't go away from there. Everything was very much a home based. By the way, similar to what we see by the Seder, that of all Yom Tovim, the Seder is the only the main chagiga of Pesach is the Seder, and the Seder is mostly done at home. There's actually an answer from the Rebbe that Pesach should be done with your family at home. So the idea is that you're at home, you're in your homes. Mostly it's done as a home-based idea. And this is the idea that this comes to Pesach Mitzrayim, that there was an obligation that it should be in the house. Let's go back to what the Mishnah said about putting the blood. So the Mefarshim actually say that the putting the blood, maybe even comes from the Gemara, that the putting on the blood wasn't just like they put it on the walls, but on the doorpost. That the doorpost was like the mizbeach of Mitzrayim, of their carbon. In other words, the Braisa says that they didn't have to put it on the mizbeach. But another way to look at it is that they didn't have an actual mizbeach. But what was the mizbeach? Their doorposts were their mizbeach, and that became their mizbeach. And the Rebbe is medaik from the Rambam, the Rogat Shaver, and the Rambam that there's actually two different halachas. There's one halacha that you have to sprinkle the blood. By every carbon, you have to sprinkle the blood, and that was like an avoid that the person had to do, to sprinkle the blood. Whereas by Mitzrayim, it wasn't enough just to sprinkle the blood on the doorpost. What happens if it doesn't reach it? Rogat Shaver speaks about what happens if you sprinkle it, but it doesn't actually reach the mizbeach, but you did the mitzvah or not. But in Mitzrayim, why were they told that they have to bring the Korban Pesach? Why did they put the blood on the doorpost? Hashem should see it, and Hashem should skip over their homes. Which means that it's not enough that they had a carbon, it's not enough that they sprinkled it towards the walls. They actually had to place it on the doorpost. In other words, it wasn't the sprinkling or the spraying of the blood that was the ikar. The ikar was that it reached the doorpost. So from all these differences that we see by the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, different than future. Number one, the fact that they, you can look at it, that they put on the doorpost, so it's like a unique idea of Mitzrayim. But besides the fact that they put on the doorpost, the Rogat is Medaik and the Rambam, that not just it went on the doorpost, but they actually, the mitzvah that it should be the Haggah, that it should be placed, it should reach the doorpost. And the fact that they have to do everything in their homes. So the Rebbe explains the reason is because this is the first mitzvah that the Yidden are getting as they're becoming a people. What's the tachas hakavana why the Eibishter gave his Torah mitzvahs? As we all know, so this the main tachas hakavana is lasas work dir b'tachteinu. Where does the dir b'tachteinu begin? In your own gashmistic house. The own gashmistic house has to be a place where we make a dir b'tachteinu. And so therefore, the very first carbon that the Yidden brought, the carbon was given to them in a way that every element of the carbon showed that it was negei of the gashmius, the gashmistic place where they brought the carbon. And so therefore, the mizbeach, the mizbeach that they put on the carbon, what the goodness ezev that they put on the blood that they put onto the doorpost, And the fact that they stayed home for every part of the korban until the morning was a way of creating that this home became like the Beis HaMikdash. And just like the Beis HaMikdash is an exact spot, and this is this place, this is the holiness, this became their Beis HaMikdash in there. In other words, just that Rebbe spoke already earlier, but the idea that the Rebbe said that everyone's house has to be a Beis Chabad, and every house has to be a Mikdash Ma'at, that the Rebbe spoke in Tov Shem Zayin and on, that every single home and every single room in the home has to be a Mikdash Ma'at. This started in Mikdash Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim, when the Yidden made their first Korban Pesach, it was done in a way that the house itself had to be shown that this was the mini Beis HaMikdash that they're creating in order to explain to them that this is what Yiddishkeit is going to look like as you go out of Mitzrayim and you become a people. The Mishnah continues, back to the Mishnah, that they had to eat the Korban Pesach, had to be eaten very quickly. In that one night. The Gemara says that this is not a difference of the really between Pesach and Deis. Also in Pesach Mitzvah, we say every day in Korbanos, it has to be eaten at Chatzos until the night, which is like Pesach Mitzvah, just like Pesach and L'Deis. However, the ideal Chipazin is a unique element that we find by Yitzis Mitzrayim, like the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, Perek Lamed Aleph, that the whole idea of Yitzis Mitzrayim had to be in a way that we hurried out, because even though we left Mitzrayim, but the Mitzrayim didn't leave us. In other words, the Mitzrayim, the Klipa was still b'taktei. The word in the Esav Chassidus that Yitzis Mitzrayim is avodah v'skafya, but we still have a Yitzhara that we have to suppress. And so therefore, if we take our time and we hang out with him and we get too cozy with the Yitzhara, he may overcome us. So therefore, it has to be an Eifin of Kipazin. The Rebbe says that we have to flee Mitzrayim, that we have to be able to outsmart Mitzrayim by suppressing Mitzrayim, and that's part of the Kipazin, the rush that we go out of Mitzrayim. What does it mean that Pesach Deis is all 7 days? So here, we're talking about not the actual Korban Pesach, but the chametz, the Isser of chametz and matzah, that continues for 7 days. So this just goes back to a very interesting point that we said before. We said before that the reason why it's called Pesach, the Yom Tov Pesach, because of the Korban Pesach, but the Korban Pesach was brought on out of Yom Tov, and we actually ate the Korban the first night. What does today have to do with the Korban Pesach? So we see here from the lashon of the Mishnah here, and also the previous Mishnah that speaks about the difference between the Pesach Rishon and the Pesach Sheni. But the Gemara there, the Mishnah there says that Pesach Rishon, the mitzvah of matzah, is for 6 days, or in addition to the korban. In other words, the whole week of Pesach. So we see there that the mitzvah of eating matzah and the isser of having chametz is a continuation of the Korban Pesach. In other words, the mitzvah, the Korban Pesach, in the like Dr. Rebbe used to put the Torah from the Mishnah from the Beis Yaglili, that in the times when they went out of Mitzrayim, they had an obligation to eat matzah and not to eat chametz only that day that they left. It was a one day. It was the day that they brought the Korban Pesach. That was the day that they ate matzah. That was the day that they weren't allowed to eat chametz. And then Pesach is over. It was a one day. You brought the Korban Pesach. How long does the Yom Tov last? So you can say because it was the night, so it lasted over the next day also. So that whole day they weren't allowed to have. But what does the next day have to do with it? However, when the Yidden left the latest for the future generations, the Yom Tov of Pesach, Al Shem HaKorban, continues for 6 days, from 7 till Shliach Pesach. The Rebbe explains in the Kutei Torah that only as a result of the Korban Pesach and the eating of the matzah every day for 6 days after the Korban Pesach, that's what gives us the ability to celebrate Kriyas Yam Suf on the 7th day. As the way Alter Rebbe says it, celebrating eating matzah for 6 days is what creates the 7th day Yom Tov. That by eating matzah 6 days, we create the 7th day. And the sign they didn't have that. After Rebbe says because they had Moshe and Aaron with them, so they had such a great deal of the course with Moshe and Aaron. 1 day matzah and Moshe Al Tzufketan. But by us, we need a full week of eating matzah. Alter Rebbe actually says in a very interesting way that we know the first week of Svida is the famous sefer that explains about Gebrox. That the reason why we eat Gebrox on the 8th day is because we went through a full week of Svida. That's our counting of Svida, which starts on the 2nd day. But as far as the Eibishter is concerned, Yili Yitzis Mitzrayim starts on the first day. So which is the first complete week of Svida as far as Hashem's concerned? L'mayla Lamata. When do we finish the first Mida completely Mitzad L'mayla Lamata? At Shvishal Pesach. Shvishal Pesach. And it started a day earlier for Hashem. So the L'mayla Lamata starts the day before. So therefore, the 6 days of eating matzah after we left Mitzrayim, that was the Aveda of going through day by day to incorporate in all of the midas and all the Shabbat midas, an additional 6 days in addition to the first day, the 6 days that we incorporate into all of our midas, the matzah what the Korban Pesach is here to accomplish. So therefore, when they went out of Mitzrayim, they only needed 1 day for the Korban Pesach and the matzah and the Isser Chametz. However, we continue that the Isser of Chametz and the obligation to eat, or the need to eat matzah, there's no obligation to eat matzah, but the need to eat matzah continues for a full week. In other words, the celebration of Korban Pesach goes on a whole week. You see from this Mishnah that the whole week of Pesach is a celebration of the Korban Pesach. And that's how the Mishnah refers to it. Okay, so just very quickly, Minyan speaks about here about the chipaz, and there is another difference between, it's not directly in the Korban Pesach. There is another difference between the way they were celebrated in Mitzrayim, the way they were celebrated in the future generations. The Rebbe is medayik from the pasuk that the obligation of matzah oini, to eat matzah as we eat it, that's just flour and water with no other ingredients, was only began after they left Mitzrayim. But while they were in Mitzrayim, they were allowed to eat matzah, that egg matzah. They were allowed to have egg matzah for the seder. Matzah shira. They were allowed to have, it's called rich matzah, matzah that has other ingredients other than flour and water, which even as Ashkenazim, we don't eat it on Pesach. But even if we do eat it on Pesach, even those that do eat that on Pesach, they're not allowed to use it for the seder, for the actual mitzvah of matzah. For the mitzvah of matzah, we learn from the pasuk lechem. The Gemara says only flour and water. However, in Mitzrayim, the Rebbe was medayik for the pasuk that they were able to eat matzah shira. The Rebbe says the reason is because, go back to what we said before, that the chipaz and the rushing out, which also includes the idea that the matzah is just flour and water. That's the galus, the skafia that we have in this galus. When Mashiach comes, it says lo chipaz and telechin. We're not going to rush out because it'll be the avodah v'sapcha that will transform the Yetzer Hara. That's the idea of matzah shira. That's the rich matzah, that the seichel, das, and understanding. And being that the Mitzias Mitzrayim is also the beginning of the Gula Sida, so therefore an element of the Gula Sida is already expressed in the Golus as it's in Mitzrayim, and that's the matzah shira that they had at that time. If you want to learn that sikha more in detail, it's also Chedik Tezayin, Parshas Bo. Okay, so that's Pesach. That's Pesach Mitzrayim. The next Korban Pesach we have on the list is the first year the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim that they made the Korban Pesach in the Midbar. So here we have an interesting debate. Rashi says that Chumash and Parshas Ba'aleischa, also in Parshas Boi, but in Parshas Ba'aleischa, Rashi says that why does the Torah not begin with the Korban Pesach? What we learned today in Kriyas Torah is the Parshas Ba'aleischa. But chronologically, it should be at the beginning of Chumash Ba'midbar. So Rashi says, why did we wait a couple of parshas to say it? And Rashi explains, because this was the not nice element of the Yidden. That for the full 40 years that the Yidden were in the Midbar, this was the only Korban Pesach they brought. So they were in the Midbar for 30, not for 40 years. They only brought one Korban Pesach. Why did they bring only one Korban Pesach? So here we have, and what was the Gnus? Were they obligated, not obligated? So we have multiple opinions here. The first opinion we'll bring is that Tosfos brings our Nashi. The assumption here is that the Yidden were not obligated to bring the Korban Pesach for the 40 days. Why? Because the obligation for the Korban Pesach, this is what Rashi says in Parshas Boi, that the obligation of Korban Pesach was Kisavoy Olaretz, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, that it be a Sa'aretz Tluya David, that the whole idea of Korban Pesach is only dependent when they come to Eretz Yisrael. It was one of the mitzvahs that were given to them for when they come to Eretz Yisrael. And the only reason why they did it the first year in the Midbar is because it was Mipnei Adivah, because Hashem commanded them to do it. But really, they had no obligation to bring a Korban Pesach in the desert. If that's the case, if they weren't obligated to do it, so what's the Gnus? So Yishleim Tosfos answers, the Gnus is not that they didn't bring the Korban Pesach. Why did they bring the Korban Pesach? Because they weren't in Eretz Yisrael. Why weren't they in Eretz Yisrael? Because the Avnei Menagla, because of what they did for the Menagla. They did have the but if they would have been Zeichen to go to Eretz Yisrael right away, as was the original plan, So then they would have been able to go straight in and done the Korban Pesach without a delay. So the fact that they didn't go into the Eretz Yisrael right away, that's the gnus. So according to Taisus, not making the Korban Pesach is not the problem. They weren't obligated. What's the gnus is that they didn't go into Eretz Yisrael right away as a result of an Amarag. That's one answer of Taisus. Second answer of Taisus is that the truth is that they were obligated. That the reason why they were obligated, that the Torah doesn't mean that they should bring the Korban Pesach only once they come to Eretz Yisrael. The Pasuk means to say that by bringing the Korban Pesach, they will come to Eretz Yisrael. That was the way of them going out of Mitzrayim to go to Eretz Yisrael. And if they're the Midbar, that's what will be Mizaka them to go to Eretz Yisrael. So why didn't they bring it the other days? Because the Shleimah in the fourth line, because most of the Yidden didn't have a bris in the Midbar. And as Pasuk says, and if you didn't have a bris, you can't eat it. Behind the Gnusam, and that was the sad thing, that they didn't have a bris. So why didn't they make a bris? So why didn't they make a bris? So Lamalay Malu, the official Nishba Ruach Tzefein is part of Bayim Shal, the Shaybim Midbar. Yishayin is Zufim Bavein Meraglim. So that Taisa says, why did they have a bris? Because while they were in the Midbar, there was no northern wind. And without the northern wind, it was dangerous to have a bris because it means that sun didn't shine on them. I don't understand the science of this. Rabbi Darren would be the expert on the science of this, but something with the northern wind bringing the calm and the warmth. And because there was no northern wind, it was like a chill that the Yidden had that they couldn't, and as a result, they couldn't make a bris. It was dangerous to make a bris. Why wasn't there a northern wind? Because of an Aveda. Let's go to Gemara in Yevamos. Gemara in Yevamos says that's why there was no wind. They didn't have a bris. Why? So Taisus here says the sin of the Meraglim. Rashi says the sin of Chet Ego. For whatever reason, as a result of their sins, they didn't have the proper conditions to allow for a bris. And because they didn't have the proper conditions to have a bris, so therefore, that's why they couldn't bring the Korban Pesach. So according to this opinion of Taisus, they're actually obligated to bring Korban Pesach in the desert. The only reason why they didn't do it was because they didn't have brisim. Why did they have brisim? Because of their Avedis. So that's the gnus. That's because it's not a good idea. But the problem with this opinion is, what does it mean that they didn't have a brisim? It just came out of Mitzrayim. They all had a bris the day before they came out of Mitzrayim. 2 years later, most of the Jews still have a bris. So some of the Farshim say that it means that there was members in their family that didn't have a bris. And there's an opinion that says, and it's a machlekes also, but there's an opinion that says that if a member in your family doesn't have a bris, then you can't bring a Korban Pesach either. But weiter, then that means that according to this theory, most of the people had boys, most of the people got married, or even if they were young when they came out, and they had children, they all had boys that didn't have a bris. So there is a medrash actually that says that when the Eibishter commanded the Yidden after Matan Torah, they should go back to their tents. In other words, the Eibishter commanded them to go back to be with their wives. So as a result of that, the Eibishter commanded them, so therefore they were all zeichet to have banim sfarim. They all had a boy. That means, they call them the COVID babies, or this babies. There was the Matan Torah babies. There was a whole, every year, it says every year, had a Ben Zachar after 9 months after Matan Torah. That's what the message says. But in Pshutish Mikra, we don't have a reason why most of the Yidden shouldn't be able to bring a Korban Pesach. You'd have to say that every Yid either himself didn't have a bris, which means that he didn't come out of Mitzrayim for the first 2 years. He came out of Mitzrayim, he should have had a bris before he left Mitzrayim. And second, or he had a child that didn't have a bris. So therefore, there's Rabbeinu Yitzchak and Taisus and Yevamos. He says no. He says the truth is they brought the Korban Pesach. He has a totally different approach than Rashi. Okay, so far we had Rashi saying that they didn't bring the Korban. First, till now we had Rashi saying they weren't obligated to bring the Korban Pesach because you have to wait to Eretz Yisrael. And the Gnus is that they didn't make it to Eretz Yisrael. Why didn't you make it to Eretz Yisrael? Because you have Vedas. You have Taisus who says that they're obligated to bring the Korban Pesach, but they couldn't bring the Korban Pesach because they had a bunch of Areilim there. And why did they have a bunch of Areilim? Because of their Avedas, they couldn't make the circumstance didn't allow them to make a bris. And now the Rabbeinu Yitzchak comes and says, no, they made a bris. They actually brought a Korban Pesach throughout the Midbar. So why does the Gemara say that they didn't bring a Korban Pesach throughout the Midbar? But there was only the first year was the only time they did it properly. All the other years they didn't do it properly. Why did they do it properly? So Tosfos doesn't explain it here, but based on what the other Rishonim say, is because they didn't, because they had a Reilim there. Because they had a Reilim there, at least some of the Yidden had it. And because some of the Yidden had a Reilim, so therefore not all the Yidden could bring the Korban Pesach properly. But Pshuta Shamikra, the Rebbe says, Rashi doesn't explain any of this. Rashi doesn't say that they didn't go in because of Meraglim. Baalais was before the Meraglim. They doesn't say that. Rashi makes it as if it's obvious why they didn't do it. And so it's another beautiful sikha, Chelek Chav Gimel, beautiful sikha, where the Rebbe explains that the Genus is, the Genus is, not that they didn't bring the Korban Pesach. The Genus is that they didn't ask to bring the Korban Pesach. Here you have a couple of Yidden who couldn't bring the Korban Pesach, and they complained to the Eibishter Lamani Gara. We just learned in Chumash today, in the Kriya today, Lamani Gara, and the Eibishter agreed, and he says you have a Pesach Sheni. Comes the next year, and the Yidden find out they're not obligated to bring a Korban Pesach, and the Yidden say, "Oh, I'm not obligated. It's okay." We all know the feeling of when we have an obligation to do a mitzvah, we do it, and I always say, "Oh, you're not chayiv." You're not chayiv? Oh, I'm simcha. I heard a word during COVID. Someone had a good word. What does it mean? That when you were told not to do an avodah, and Hashem told you, oh, you don't have to do that mitzvah, you were happy. You were happy, you're happy that you didn't have to do the avodah. That is the Yidden are Mitzrayim. Hashem says, oh, next year you don't have to do a Korban Pesach. So the Yidden say, really? What says? No, till you come to Eretz Yisrael, it's okay. Now, one Yid complained, Lama Nigara. That was the Gnus. Then the Rebbe, if that word is not good enough, the Rebbe is different, aggressive. Says, look, okay, so that's good for all the Yidden. What about Moshe Narin? Why did Moshe Narin not say Lama Nigara? The Rebbe says because Moshe Narin knew that if they say Lama Nigara, it's going to look bad at the Yidden. I talked about one Yid says Lama Nigara, and Moshe did figure out Lama Nigara. Moshe and Aaron were ready not to ask Lama Nigara to bring a Korban Pesach for 39 years. Abid not to make the Yidden look bad that they didn't say Lama Nigara. So Akapanim, this is the opinions of what took place in the Pesach Midbar. In the Pesach Midbar, we have Rashi's opinion that they only brought it the first year because they weren't obligated, and the Gnus, according to the Rebbe, the Gnus of Rashi is, according to Rashi, the Gnus of the Yidden is that they didn't ask to bring it. According to Tosfos, the Gnus is that the fact that they didn't go into the Midbar, into Eretz Yisrael, that they were stuck in the middle because of their Avedas. According to the second opinion in Tosfos, the Gnus is that they were actually obligated to bring a Korban Pesach, but they were unable to bring it because they had so many Areilim. But then it's a little shy to understand why there were so many Areilim there. So yeah, unless you go according to the Medrash, according to Rabbeinu Yitzchak and Tosfos, according to the Ri and Tosfos, the reason why they brought it, the reason that they actually did bring the Korban Pesach for the 40 years in the Midbar, because not all the Yidden brought it because of that Areilim, and therefore it wasn't considered properly done. Third kufa, the Yidden came to Eretz Yisrael. What happened? The Yidden came to Eretz Yisrael. So there was periods of time that the Yidden didn't have a Beis HaMikdash or a Mishkan. There was a time that the Yidden had a bama. A bama was the ability that you can make a carbon in your backyard. The Rebbe actually says that it's mashma. That's not true. Everyone had bummers in their backyard. Like you had a grill and you had a bummer to bring a carbon. There was unique places where they would make a bummer, but the point was that it was like a collected. There was you had private shuls, like in Crown Heights, you have your class shuls. They had the class bummers where they would bring the karbanos. However, the Mishnah says that not every carbon could be brought on there. The Mishnah says, "Ein ben bama g'dei lebama ktana el psacha." That in a bama ktana you could bring any carbon, but you can't bring a Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach has to be brought on a bama g'dei. Then the Mishnah clarifies that. If the carbon that you're bringing is your own neder and your own nedava, so then you bring it on the bama. However, but if it's a set carbon meaning that it's not a donation, it's a chiyuv that you have to bring, you can't bring it on the bama, it has to go onto the bama gedayla. The Gemara said, what is medayik? I'm going to the whole Gemara, the Reish and the Seifa, that first you said only the Korban Pesach, then you said anything that's not a neder and a dava. So the Gemara says that the Mishnah means ke'ein psachim, which means that any carbon that has a set time cannot be brought on the bama ketana. It has to be brought on the bama gedayla. So the Korban Pesach has to be brought only on the bama gedayla. So I didn't see any explanation for this, but what you see over here is that even though, according to this opinion, multiple korbanos could not be brought in the Bama Gedela, but the Gemara, the Bama Katana, had to be brought in the Bama Gedela, but the Gemara identifies the Korban Pesach as the prototype to teach you the other ones. Bama Gedela would mean Bama Gedela meant like the public Bama, like the Mizbeach that they would have in where the temporary Mishkan was. So again, it could be Api Halacha makes the most sense to use Korban Pesach. But certainly there has to be a also here that from all the Korbanos that we're saying that have to be brought in the Bama Gedela, we're identifying the Korban Pesach as that example. Maybe it has to do with what the Rebbe said before, that in Mitzrayim, the Bama Ketana, every Yid had his own house was his Mizbeach. So the Mishnah is coming to teach us that even though in Mitzrayim everyone's house became their own Mizbeach, but once they came to Eretz Yisrael, even though they were bringing karbanis at the period that they're bringing karbanis in the Bama Ketana, but it doesn't apply to the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach still have to be the Bama Gedela with the Yidden all brought together, which will be understood in the next piece. Then we have the primary Korban Pesach, which is the time of the Beis HaMikdash. The Korban Pesach Beis HaMikdash, that was how all the halachas on Korban Pesach. For that you have to learn the whole Hilchos Korban Pesach of the Rambam. You know all the details of how it was done in the Beis HaMikdash. But just one interesting thing to bring brought out of it, which is negate, and the next Korban Pesach will bring. Emir Hashem next year will bring a Korban Pesach, and the Pashtus, even though will be Mekadosh Apiyariya, the Pashtus, the account that we have is accurate. That next year Erev Pesach, even for Mekadosh Apiyariya, Erev Pesach is going to be Shabbos. So Erev Pesach Shabbos, the Gemara says a story. The Tana Rabbana. That there was a Erev Pesach was on Shabbos, and they didn't know whether they were allowed to bring a Korban Pesach on Shabbos or not. So and the halacha zu nisamim in Pseida. The Bnei Pseida didn't remember whether you're allowed to bring a Korban Pesach or not. Shachal yod Pesach neicha Shabbos in lad. So Amr they said to Misham Shalem Pesach neicha Shabbos. Does anyone know the halacha? There's a lot of information to understand how did they forget that halacha. What do you mean they didn't know? But the truth is, it's the most rare kviyus for Pesach to be on Erev Shabbos. Erev Pesach to be on Shabbos. It's the most rare kviyus. So maybe it just wasn't didn't happen so often. So they didn't remember. They were doing still. Our calendar is not out of nowhere, right? You don't think so? I don't know. Okay. Definitely on our calendar, it's the most rare. It's not the same day. Yeah, but they could have played it with then also. No, it's right. Yeah, you're right. Okay. I don't know. I don't know anything on the subject. I don't know. I don't know anything on the subject. Anyway, so they said, yes, there is. A Yid came from Bavel. His name is Hillel. Hillel Zakin. Hillel, we know from the base Hillel Academy. Hillel came, he knows. So they called him and he said, do you know the Korban Pesach Teicha Shabbos or not? He said, what do you mean? We have over 200 Korban Pesach that are Teicha Shabbos. What does he mean by that? The Korban Tamid, every day, every Shabbos, we have a Korban Tamid and the Korban Musaf that's done on Shabbos. That's Teicha. Why? Because that's the day to bring it. So the Korban Pesach in B'moyad on the day that you're supposed to bring the Korban, so it's Teicha Shabbos. As it goes on to bring the Pesach. So what the Rebbe says in the Yerushalmi, it's actually more clear that it's not just the fact that it has a set day, but the fact that it's treated like a Korban Sibur. In other words, Hillel says that the Korban Pesach has to be treated like a Korban Sibur. And if it's a Korban Sibur, it's brought on Shabbos. Whereas the Bnei B'Seira, they were treating the Korban Pesach like a Korban Yachid, and therefore they felt that it shouldn't be. The Korban Yachid is not Teicha Shabbos. In other words, the Rebbe learns that at the heart of the machlekes here of whether Korban Pesach is Teicha Shabbos or not is whether you should treat it as a Korban Tzivin and a Korban Yachid. Why is that? Because as we've seen, the Korban Pesach is very unique. On one hand, it has to be done in the Beis HaMikdash. It has to be done by Bama Gedela. It has to be done all the Yidden together. On the other, as a Korban Tzibur. On the other hand, you did it individual. It's not one korban on behalf of all the Yidden. Usually a Korban Tzibur man, you bought one animal for all the Yidden. Over here, every Yid had to bring his own korban, bishtat with others, because it had to be eaten. If you are a type of guy that can eat a whole animal yourself, would you bring your own carbon? It's machlekes in the Gemara whether you can bring whether a yachid and being carbon, whether the definition of a carbon pesach has to have more than one person. But one thing's for sure, that it's meant that it's individuals that brought it. And the Rebbe goes through many details where you show the carbon yachid and the carbon tzibur. So that became the debate of whether it should be a carbon, whether we should treat the carbon pesach as a carbon yachid as a carbon tzibur, whether it should be doicha Shabbos or not. La halacha, we follow Hillel that it's doicha Shabbos because at the heart of it is a carbon tzibur, incorporating within it the laws of a carbon yachid. So it's interesting. Why is it that you have this by carbon pesach more by other Yom Tovim? So if you see something in the Rebbe's Torah, something very unique, that the Rebbe always shows, and especially by the Yom Tovim, you see by all the Yom Tovim, by Shavuos, by Sukkot, by Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that the Yom Tovim, Yiddishkeit Bechlal, and the Yom Tovim Befrat, are a combination of a Yachid and Tzibur. The famous story with the Frierdiker Rebbe, that he was on the train and they wanted to know which ism is the right one, Api Torah, and he said everything comes from Torah. In other words, Api Torah, and everyone, this is an ongoing, whether it's in whatever type of school it is, whether it's in politics, whether it's in social justice or social dynamics. There's always the classroom education. You have a yachid and a tzibur, and you have to always know which one. How do you balance the yachid and the tzibur? And the Rebbe shows that Yiddishkeit Bechlal is an ongoing balancing of the yachid and the tzibur, including all the Yom Tovim have that element as well. And certainly Pesach, the latest Am Yisrael, when the Yidden were born, we have that ongoing tension of the yachid and the tzibur coming together in order to make the Yidden. So in Mirz Hashem next year, if the calendar falls, if the Iyah goes according to the way our calendar is, we'll bring a Korban Pesach on Shabbos with the element of that tzibur, although there's a lot of different halachas that have to be brought that way as well. What happens when we don't have a Beis HaMikdash? The fifth kufa is, what about a Korban Pesach when we don't have a Beis HaMikdash? So there's two elements to that. Number one, traditionally we don't have a Korban Pesach, what do? So on the Seder plate, we have something symbolic, but it's not something we do for the Korban Pesach. We don't eat the Korban Pesach, we don't do something for the Korban Pesach. It's just like a symbolic zroya on the table. But the truth is, it is something we do for the Korban Pesach. What is that? That's the afikoimon. That we eat the afikoimon in place of the Korban Pesach, and that there's halachas that we do with the afikoimon because it resembles the Korban Pesach. The whole idea that the afikoimon has to be the last thing we eat. That you're supposed to eat it where you are. You can't leave and eat in two different places. Afikoimon. There's a lot of halachas afikoimon that we treat like the Korban Pesach. But there's an interesting machlekes between Rashi and the Rosh, the Shonim, of is the afikoimon in the place of the Korban Pesach, or which is what the Rosh says, or is the afikoimon in place of the matzah that we ate with the Korban Pesach? And within that opinion itself, Rashi has a very interesting opinion. Rashi holds that the main mitzvah that we eat, the matzah that we eat, as the mitzvah for the matzah of the night, is actually the afikoimon matzah. Because that's when they ate it in the times of the Beis HaMikdash together with the Korban Pesach. So according to Rashi, not only do we eat the matzah in place of it to remind us of the matzah that they ate with the Korban Pesach, but actually, according to Rashi, that's the mitzvah of matzah. And the only reason why we make the bracha earlier is because we're eating matzah, we have to make the bracha then. But the real mitzvah is the afikoimon. We don't paskin like that. We fulfill the mitzvah on the first matzah that we ate. However, with shayach, if you have a Chabad, this is where it comes into play. Unfortunately, Ruba de Kulam of Acheinu B'nai Yisrael that make a seder at 8. To start a seder at 8:35 is a big nisayon, and so they start the seder earlier. So what do you tell these people? You give them shmona matzah. They're eating. They're up to meitzi matzah by 7 o'clock before plagna. Whatever 6:30 before plag. What do you do? So the best eight is you tell them, listen, you do what you do. I can't tell you what to do. But ein zach zicher for yafikeman, the last thing you eat, your matzah, eat the shmona matzah at the end. In other words, like this, they ate the matzah apidin. At least they did the mitzvah of eating matzah. But Isaiah, the Shitas Rashi, they did the mitzvah perfectly according to Rashi, because according to Rashi, the afikoman is supposed to be the mitzvah of matzah. And that's what they're doing. But anyways, but according to the Rosh, It's not the matzah that they ate without the korban. According to the Rosh, it's the matzah is symbolic to the actual Korban Pesach itself. And that's why in the Haggadah, the Rebbe writes, the Rebbe writes the Rebbe brings the Haggadah, that if we're able, we should actually eat 2 kezesim for the afikoyim. 1 kezai is the Shitas Rashi for the matzah, and 1 kezai is for the Korban Pesach, according to the Rosh. So here we see that even nowadays we have the idea of a Korban Pesach. Where's another idea we have of Korban Pesach? So there's another very famous discussion from the Rebbe in Tafshin Chav Ches in 1968. The 6-day war took place on in Sivan of or the end of Iyar, of Tafshin Chav Zayin 1967 war. That year for the Pesach Sheni, the Rebbe said a sicha before Pesach Sheni, and he said that there's an opinion that says that you could bring a korban. You need another whole shiur to explain how Pesach Sheni works. But according to one opinion, Pesach Sheni is if you didn't bring the korban, the Pesach Rishon, even if you didn't do it on purpose, whatever reason, you didn't bring Pesach Rishon, but it could be your mamish guilty for not bringing the Pesach Rishon. You could still bring the Pesach Sheni, and if you don't bring the Pesach Sheni, that's when you're chayav kares. In other words, not bringing the Pesach Sheni is a chayav kares. No, it was inherent. Really, the chiyuv is on the first Pesach, but the Pesach Sheni, Korban Pesach. Now, the Rebbe has a very big chiddush. Again, this needs another whole separate shiur. But the Rebbe's chiddush is that the Pesach Sheni is all that if the reason why we don't have the Pesach Rishon is not because of circumstances that were in the Yidden, but the Torah told us not to have the korban then. For example, we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So then, if everyone is trying to bring a Pesach Sheni, knows even though no one brought a Pesach Rishon, everyone has to bring a Pesach Sheni, which is it's a big chiddush, and we'll see in a moment in the next piece. It's a big chiddush, but that's the Rebbe took it as very very pashut, that that's what the good. Certainly according to we'll see soon in the Yerushalmi, there's an opinion that says that, but the Rebbe wanted to accept that the Rebbe accepts that that's actually more than just the Yerushalmi. Even the Bavli agrees to this. And then, as a result, that means that if we're able to bring a Pesach Sheni, so and even though no one brought a Pesach Rishon, everyone has to bring a Pesach Sheni, including the Tzibur. Even the Tzibur has to bring a Pesach Sheni in that regard. The Rebbe is medayik. The Rebbe is medayik that the Pesach, the Tzibur is not nitchet the Pesach Sheni. The whole Tzibur doesn't get pushed off the Pesach Sheni, but the whole Tzibur could bring a Pesach Sheni. So being that over here, we weren't pushed off the Pesach Sheni, we just didn't bring it. So we didn't bring it, so we're all obligated to bring it on Pesach Sheni. The Yechil of Paris is about a Teisvis. He holds that you're allowed to bring a korban nowadays, even if we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. And we're chayav to bring a korban if we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So the Rebbe says if we take all these opinions, even though it's not la halacha, meaning we don't pass like a Yechil Paris, you can bring up Korban Pesach without a mizbeach. This idea that everyone moves over is also a big chiddush. But the bottom line is that we're talking about a chiyav kares. And if we're talking about a chiyav kares, the Rebbe therefore said that no one should be within 15 mil of Yerushalayim. You have to be away from Yerushalayim for Pesach Sheni. So that way, no one's going to be chayav kares for the korban. Now, to be very clear, the Rebbe was not saying to bring the Korban Pesach, because the halacha we don't pass them like that. But when you have a chiyav kares, you have to be very careful. Why are we so makbid on Pesach? Why do we make ourselves crazy with the food on Pesach? The reason why we make ourselves crazy with the food on Pesach is because it's a chiyav kares to eat chatz shalom chametz on Pesach. So that's why we're so careful. So in that same regard, the Rebbe says that being that the chiyav, not bring a korban Pesach Sheni when you're able to bring one, even according to one opinion is a chiyav kares, then we should be very careful. And the Rebbe therefore said that all the Chassidim, or whoever's going to listen to him, should go out of Yerushalayim and be more than 15 mil, be derech hachoyka, be away, not be obligated to bring the Pesach Sheni. Rabbi Zevin took it up with the Rebbe. He was arguing with the Rebbe. The Rebbe argued right back. The Rebbe was very firm about it. But then later, I think the letters from Tavshin Lamed Hey, someone asked the Rebbe about it. Why the Rebbe is not bringing it up again. And the Rebbe wrote, already on day 7, meaning the 6-day war, right? On day 7, the Israelis already invited the Goyim to come back and take over Har HaBayis. And so therefore, it's not possible. You know what happened? If you saw it this week, last week, some kids brought a Gdi onto Har HaBayis, I don't know what they thought they were going to do with it. The Israelis arrested them because they found a kid. They have these provocative kids that they just bring a little gedi with them to make as if they're going to go onto the mizbeach to make it machal levidim. They arrest them. You know what happened if the Yidden, the Rebbe brings a pasuk from Navi where the Yidden like called the goyim up, like come take it. The Rebbe said this is the Rebbe started screaming ready from right. The 6-day war is over. We have full control of how to bias. Instead of keeping the full control of how to bias, we immediately, the Rebbe says, B'yoyim Azayin, on the 7th day already, they invited the guy to come take control. Nowadays, there's no way that we could bring a Korban Pesach. We brought a Korban Pesach, and the whole world would explode. So therefore, the Rebbe said it's not shaykh anymore. It was 1 year, Tashach of Ches, that the Rebbe said it's maybe possible. The truth is, later, when the Rebbe said it wasn't possible, he went back to day 7, meaning even the Tashach of Ches, that, in hindsight, it sounds like a Tashach of Ches, the Rebbe is saying, I don't even know if they were shaykh to do it that year. There was years later, they was looking back that the problems didn't start like later they gave back Eretz Yisrael. Immediately they gave back Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it wasn't as public then, I don't know. But the Rebbe's point is that therefore it's not shaykh anymore. And finally, the Korban Pesach, as it's for this year, Tafshin Pei Dalid. And Anna wants to know if I wrote this before Pesach, on Pesach. He wants to know if I'm Kefir or not. So Tafshin Pei Dalid, and I wrote this last night. And Tafshin Pei Dalid, what about a Korban Pesach this year? So it goes back to what we mentioned before. Of whether, not the weather comes afterwards. Mashiach is going to come, so now whether we're chayiv to bring a korban, a Pesach Sheni, if we didn't bring a Pesach Rishon. So nitinly so livnus Pesach Chira. If the Yidden were given opportunity to build the Beis Hamikdash in between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, so the Yerushalmi says, the first opinion says, Yachid is a Pesach Sheni, and Tzibur is a Pesach Sheni. The Yachid does brings a korban up in Pesach Sheni, but not the Tzibur. Yehuda says Tzibur is a Pesach Sheni, that the Tzibur could make a Pesach Sheni. She came with Tzina Bechizkiya, Shas a Pesach Sheni. Chizkiya brought a Pesach Sheni for all the Yidden together. Hadod Diksiv, Gimar B'S'am, Rabbis V'Flaim U'Menashe. So therefore, if we pass on like Rabbi Yehuda, we have to go back to see what the Rebbe says the Gabi Yerushalayim nowadays. But if we pass like Rabbi Yehuda, that the Tzibur could do a Pesach Sheni, so then that would mean that the Mashiach's going to come now, maybe will be able to bring a Pesach Sheni to make up for the korban. Good to make.
Mashiach comes out and make a Shachianu the last days, right?